Hello, welcome to the programme which brings together some of the UK's leading media commentators with the foreign correspondents who write for the folks back home under the Dateline, London. Pope Francis appoints new cardinals to shape his legacy. Could more than married priests be on his to-do list? As Turkey shows that the powerful abhor a vacuum, in this case in northern Syria, could there be a second Arab Spring as the powerless resist? With me are the French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani, Catherine Pepinster, the former editor of the Catholic weekly The Tablet, Agnès Poirier, who writes for the French news magazine Marianne, and the broadcaster Michael Goldfarb, whose podcast is The First Rough Draft of History. But first, before all that, Brexit. For journalists, the story that just keeps on giving. And yes, it's been a very strange week, this, because we had this rather gloomy readout of a phone call with Angela Merkel by Downing Street saying that it looked like a deal was essentially impossible. Then,
if she ever said that to Boris Johnson.
Then Leo Varadkar and Boris Johnson went for a walk in the park,
yes.
And suddenly things were back on, and now we're in a tunnel. Should we be pleased or baffled?
Well, it depends if there's light out of the tunnel. We'll see. It's, you know, so it looks like Boris Johnson sort of gave a concession or rather had a glimpse of the real world and suddenly thought, OK, well, this is it. And it looks as if we're back to something that the EU actually proposed 2 years ago, which is a border in the Irish Sea. So now we don't know the details. The EU is only interested in one thing, whether it works or not, and whether controls and checks can take place. And now, of course, and the irony, of course, it's part of what May's proposal was about a year ago. So we'll see whether there's a deal, probably. Hopefully, in a few days' time during the summit next week. And then, of course, you know, the DUP has been quite silent. Usually they reject it, you know, straight away. They didn't do that, so there's a little, you know, glimmer of hope. And Saturday, the battle, you know, the mother of all battles at the House of Commons.
Next Saturday.
Next Saturday. But then, of course,
War.
the opposition, that is to say Labour, could say, OK, well, we'll attach it with a vote for a second referendum.
Catherine, on that question of what happens at Westminster, is it a sense among those who are in favour of leaving the European Union that actually what's changed is not only the personalities but also the timing, and that now, because the deadline is so imminent, nobody seems to want to go beyond the 31st of October in terms of the practicalities. Certainly not in the Conservative Party, because of the threat from the Brexit Party, who will say, you lied to us, you misled us, you're all traitors. And therefore potentially defeat them or contribute to their defeat in a general election, that maybe people in the Conservative Party who wouldn't have bought this deal 6 months ago might buy this deal this time.
Well, what struck me about this is that journalists are often called deadline bandits. We all work to the deadline. And it seems to me that now we have deadline bandits among the politicians, the bureaucrats. And in some ways it makes me furious. We've all been enduring this for so long. And now, as you were just saying, we may end up with something that Theresa May was talking about quite some time ago.
Yes, imagine how she feels if she wants him wave a successful piece of paper, a deal.
Exactly.
And it's not so dissimilar from one she had rejected.
That's absolutely right. Of course, the House of Commons has become more complicated since then. We have independent Conservatives. There are people who have defected here and there. It will be very interesting to see if Boris Johnson can get this through. There has been some suggestion that there are, I think, around 23 Labour MPs who've been indicating to Brussels that they may well go for signing up to the deal. So there's everything
even without
to
the
play
DUP,
for.
there's a possibility for Boris Johnson,
well,
provided he gets a deal.
Well, provided he gets a deal, which we still don't know, because we haven't even entered the tunnel.
The idea of isolating the negotiators from the watching media.
Yeah. May I say that I'm pretty certain that when Theresa May had just resigned, I was on the show and I did predict that Boris Johnson would essentially move a couple of semicolons on her withdrawal agreement, claim all the credit, and then go to the country and get a big victory in a general election, which I still think is what he plans to do. I mean, there's still a lot to be done, and, you know, 21 former Conservative MPs still in the House of Commons, and you've got the Stephen Kinnock-Caroline Flint-led faction on the Labour Party that feel we have to honour the vote of 3 years ago. So all of that can happen. But, you know, we have always, in talking about it on this program, forgotten there are 27 other countries on the other side of the English Channel, or La Manche, and, you know, you have to take into account how they're going to view these changes.
Nabila.
Well, I agree with Catherine. I think, you know, words like positive and constructive are the kind of terms that are coming out of the entire Brexit saga at the moment. But that was always going to be predictable because we are so close to crucial deadlines. And of course, you know, whatever they're thinking or doing, they have to at least sound as though they're locked into intensive, you know, discussions. But I think despite 11th hour hope, the realistic prospect at the moment is a further delay, which will allow time for more, a lot more dramatic, you know, episodes and speculations.
And another deadline.
Before yet another spurious deadline.
We've hit our deadline on that subject.
But a final word, if I may. I think what this really shows is that Brexit is not a destination, but an ongoing journey. And it's become shorthand for Britain's ongoing discussions with its trading neighbours, really.
20 years ago, they said much the same about devolution, and we're still on that particular road. This weekend, the UK's Anglicans will join the celebrations as a former Anglican is canonised by the Pope. John, later Cardinal Newman, tried to turn the clock back in the Church of England, restoring some of the beliefs and rituals which had existed before the English Reformation and the split with Rome. Eventually, he converted instead. Pope Francis will preside at a time when the Catholic Church is considering turning back the clock many centuries to the days before priests were required to be unmarried and celibate. Catherine, in terms of what the Pope is up to, this is the Newman canonisation, strictly observing Catholic tradition and ritual. We have the, you know, the miracles that have to be recognised and approved before he could be made a saint. Why then is Pope Francis so willing to confront traditionalists over the question of married priests?
Well, one thing I would point out about Cardinal Newman is that Cardinal Newman was somebody who actually said that he would drink to conscience first and the Pope second. He was a great advocate of conscience being really important. And so perhaps Pope Francis is thinking about what his conscience is telling him. We have had this great gathering in Rome in recent days of people from the Amazon, the Synod of the Amazon, where they are talking about the issues that really affect the people of the Amazon basin. One of those things is the environment. Pope Francis is very passionate about the state of God's creation and the impact of climate change. But the people of the Amazon live great distances from priests, and they need priests. And there was a consultation before this gathering of bishops from the Amazon to ask people there what they wanted, and they said, we need more priests, so therefore we need married men to be priests. And so this has been put on the agenda. It's interesting because Pope Francis is listening to what those people are saying. He's asking the bishops to discuss it, and those bishops seem to be indicating that they think it's a good thing too. The Vatican loves bump, it loves reports and paperwork. So there's been a report before this synod coming out of the people of the Amazon. The bishops from the Amazon will then produce a report. Pope Francis will read this, and then he will produce something, and it may well say the people of the Amazon can have married priests.
And would that be a Trojan horse, in a sense? Would that be potentially opening up the whole question for the rest of the Church? Well, can you isolate it as a local... I mean, in a sense, they did with the conversion from the Church of England, didn't they? Those who
you can
went to Rome
isolate
could be married.
You can isolate it in different ways. You can have a bishop say, I want this married man to become a priest. You can have a region say, we want our region to have them, and the Pope can say yes. So you can do it in different ways. But as you were asking, Michael, is this a Trojan horse?
Well, I don't know if it's a Trojan horse. I know that there's resistance. I mean, certainly in the First World, just, you know, there is a strong, and ever since Francis ascended to the papacy, there's a strong contingent of ultra-conservatives. And the broken cover, I mean, Steve Bannon, whose name keeps coming up on this panel, is a leader and is a kind of behind-the-scenes convener of the global First World anti-Francis group. I note with some joy that his attempt to start a right-wing Catholic place in Molise, just south of Rome, has... I mean, they've been thrown out. I mean, the Italian government essentially threw them out this week. So that's good. On the other hand, you know, as someone who's not party pre to all this, what I do wonder is, going back deep into the history of the church, I've been reading Tom Holland's new book, Dominion, which is really brilliant, about the history of Christianity in the West. The idea of celibacy is an add-on. It's an add-on, it seems to me, not directed by the heavens, but one that is deeply mundane. It was a necessary political maneuver at the end of the Roman period, the beginning of the Middle Ages. And, why not? If the processes of the church have been one of constant reinvention and reformation, then why not a reformation that can bring a non-celibate clergy back to the fore, and women offering
Well,
up.
that's the next question, is why, if married men, why not women?
Well, on the question of unmarried priests first, I mean, I can't pretend to be a Roman Catholic theologian, but I've heard that there are references to the first Pope, Peter, having been married. So that may be a very reasonable precedent. And of course, as you said, Michael, traditionalists are of course furious, as you would expect. But with the number of priests right down, they have to do something, I would expect. And in many ways, Pope Francis is being an innovator here, just like Henry Newman was, in bringing this very controversial issue to the fore. And
yes?
Look, I mean, the Catholic Church is in a terrible crisis, probably the worst it's known since, the Inquisition. And in the world we live in, it's not only about the end of celibacy for priests and nuns, but also, the status of divorces, for instance, So if the Catholic Church wants to have any future, it needs to live in the time it lives in. That is to say, priests need to be able to marry, like the Anglicans.
And he's thinking about the future as well as the present, isn't he? Because, I mean, last weekend, I think I'm right in saying he got to the stage where he appointed enough cardinals that effectively he has appointed more than half of those who will ultimately choose his successor.
Yes, that's right. It's one of the things that popes do. They appoint cardinals who belong to what's called the College of Cardinals, and they then go into what's called the conclave and elect the next pope. And it's always said, the current pope tries to shape this college and ensure his legacy continues.
Let's face it, they're old men usually, so they haven't got long to do the work themselves.
But of course, John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI tried to shape the College of Cardinals, and they were very different popes to Francis. But who did their cardinals elect but Pope Francis? So it doesn't necessarily work that way.
And this is a church that is hugely important to so many people around the world who are practicing Catholics, and has huge political influence even for those who are not necessarily practicing Catholics. But it's also a church that has you think of the South American church and the African church, quite different in terms of their outlook in that case.
Well, it's interesting that you mention Africa and other parts of the world, because, of course, at one time, the Catholic Church was very much a European church, and something that Pope Francis has really focused on is the fact that it's in decline in Europe, it's growing in other parts of the world, and being from Latin America himself, that's clearly something that has been his focus.
Now, in Washington, it's been a case of Donald Duck as the flak flies in the impeachment inquiry. The US president was bombarded by fellow Republicans too after he abruptly announced he was bringing home US troops from northern Syria. You don't have to be a cynic to think the timing might be connected with President Trump's troubles at home, which had been clogging the airwaves. It's also a Recep Tayyip Erdogan pleasing move. Turkey's president has long wanted to create what he calls a safe zone, a place to deposit the hundreds of thousands of refugees his country has been hosting, and, by the way, to push Syria's Kurds away from his border. To President Erdogan, Kurds, almost without exception, are trouble, potential allies for Turkey's own restive minority. And Michael, this weekend, President Trump is saying he'd be more than happy to negotiate a ceasefire between Turkey and the Syrian Kurds. That really is a case of trying to shut the stable door after the horse has bolted.
Yeah, well, I mean, just the overnight news, it was, the idea was the Kurds in northeastern Syria had been the instrumental force in pushing ISIS back and defeating ISIS. 10,000 lives lost and many more casualties. Embedded with them were 50 to 100 American observers, special forces. And what Trump did last week, which initiated the whole sequence of chaos is he had a long phone call with Tayyip Erdogan, who's been trying to get in there for more than a year, and then in his way, just willy-nilly put out a tweet saying, I'm withdrawing all American troops, this 50 to 100 people. And he hadn't consulted with anyone on his national security team, the Defense Department, and I doubt he even consulted with the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, to whom he's relatively close. So instant chaos, because the meaning of this was to give a green light for Erdogan to finally do this thing he's been threatening to do for a long time, which is, I've been to the border many times. It's a beautiful, green, fertile plain that runs between, and you could hardly know that there's a border between Turkey and Syria, except that every half a kilometer there's a watchtower for the Turkish army, and they've been there for decades. So he does this, and within 72 hours, just as you would expect, the Turkish army goes into northeastern Syria. They have always regarded the Syrian Kurds essentially as an extension of the PKK, the Turkish Kurds with whom they've been fighting an insurgency for independence for decades and involved in domestic terrorism. So there you have the basic sequence. But you know what? He never spoke to the Department of Defense, and so these American observers were still there. And of course, yesterday, they were shelled. They were shelled. Now, luckily...
So one NATO country fatally shelling.
Yes. A NATO country essentially put the forces of another NATO country under bombardment. Now, luckily, no one was injured. But, you know, in war, things happen. And you know, if something were to happen, I think we'd be in at this level, a higher power bit of chaos. At the lower level, anyone who pays attention to this knows that many ISIS fighters have been in prison. They're being guarded by these very Kurds that Erdogan is now fighting, and within a day, jailbreaks. And so you have the prospect of a renewed Daesh, ISIS, Islamic State insurgency in that area.
Nabila, I wanted to ask about that broader picture, because this is not a stable part of the world anyway, but at the moment, with what is happening, the protests in Iraq, with America's concerns about Iran, adding another element of potential chaos, it presumably has the risk of a much wider reverberation.
Yes, I think what nobody should be underestimating in all this is that the devastating implication that this conflict could have, not just for the Middle East, but indeed globally. Turkey's escalating offensive on Syria could lead to a further displacement of 300,000 people, for example, all at a time.
We're already seeing people fleeing from the border area.
At a time when America and indeed European countries are showing absolute reluctance to admit more refugees. Turkish President Erdogan, he's also speaking about creating a safe zone for refugees in the northeast of Syria. But, there's nowhere, the chances of, anywhere being safe are next to zero, especially if the conflict escalates. And there I say, meanwhile, we have the UN Refugee Agency, who is quite rightly saying that further conflict would lead to less humanitarian aid being able to be delivered, and indeed, as Michael was saying, the possibility of having ISIS having a resurgence. And remember that this monstrous movement was one of the consequences of conflicts such as Iraq. So if we allow such wars to go on indefinitely, then obviously such violent groups are going to take advantage of the chaos.
And yes, how, because this is clearly something that's of concern to the Europeans as well, how do they try and influence what's happening, given that the US decision has already been made?
If only Europe had an army. But of course, that was always fought by Britain.
Well, we won't be that much progress. You can get on with it.
No, but I think we all felt so sick this week. And I don't know a single Kurd. You don't need to know anything about. You don't need to have gone to the Middle East or to know any Kurds to know how valiant, how brave they have been. They fought like lions for us, for the whole world, waging that war. And that's how we thank them. And this is just absolutely disgusting. And we are all hostages of Trump, who, just the flick of a Twitter finger, does this. And it's so wrong on so many levels because, as you say, I mean, apart from the fact that you don't abandon allies, you don't betray them in that way, just let's be pragmatic. You have ISIS fighters who are in jail, plus their families. We're talking about 70,000 people who are going to escape in the next few hours, the next few days, and they're going to go back to their home countries. A lot of it is in Europe. So it's creating, and that safe zone he's talking about
that
is a
old
death
phrase,
corridor.
blowback, is something that we should worry about,
Well,
and the
of
Americans
course.
should worry about.
Of course, and Europe looks, again, quite powerless. And that's, of course, you know, another element for...
What might baffle people a bit is you said it's only 50 to 100 US troops. They can't really, and even then, as advisors, in inverted commas, were they really holding back a tide in that sense?
Their presence, because, you know, the United States is slowly ceding its leadership in the world under Donald Trump. Which is quite a remarkable thing. This is stepping back, and I hate to step back too far from people I know in that region, but it seems that the sequence of this event is about providing Russia, Iran, and Turkey leadership in trying to solve the Syrian crisis, civil war, whatever, forever war. And they will not use the same standards of conflict resolution that the US would. Having 50 to 100 advisors kept Turkey from doing this. That's why immediately Trump tweeted this. Everyone in Washington who follow, you know, in the security establishment threw up their hands because they knew.
A lot of Republicans.
Yes, you say, well, it's only 50 to 100 people. I mean, there's only a couple of thousand, if that, US troops in Syria. And so that's nothing, but it's their presence because it's America. And when you step back, then suddenly having American troops there at some point in the future will not be that kind of safeguard for people who need a safeguard.
Catherine.
Well, one thing that really strikes me about this, and I really thought about this when Agnes was talking a moment ago, is the way in which the Kurdish people always seem to be the victims. And the problem, of course, is that they are stateless, and we've had this problem for such a long time. There was that moment in the 90s when something was done to help the Kurdish people when we had the safe haven and
To protect them from
to
Saddam.
protect them from Saddam.
Persecution.
But I think this shows that we really have got to think again. The UN's got to think again about the plight of the people of Kurdistan. And something needs to be done to recognise their situation, where they're caught in the crossfire between so many countries.
Nabila, I wanted to ask you a kind of related point, which is about stability across the region and how much people are prepared to put up with. We've already seen the street protests in Iraq, very violent street protests last week or so. I saw a statistic which surprised me, which is that poverty in Egypt now claims a bigger proportion of the population than it did just before the Arab Spring in 2011. There are signs of discontent in other countries as well. Could we be reaching a moment where, once again, that leads to some kind of popular uprising? Or is that just a naive European hope?
Well, I don't think there is much European or indeed Western interest, to be honest, in that part of the world. And that's one of the things that actually Trump understood. He knows that, you know, that by far the priority on most Americans' minds at the moment is angry nationalist populism, as in Britain. And they wouldn't, you know, be thinking about this conflict. You know, it wouldn't be high on their minds. Just as, you know, the Syrian war, which has already claimed over 300,000 lives and displaced millions more, is not high. Is not a, you know, is not a priority on people's mind in this part of the world. But dare I say, as Michael was saying, I think we shouldn't forget, you know, Russia's position in all this. It remains a firm backer of President Assad, and is by far the most powerful, power involved in Syria. And American foreign policy hawk should be very worried indeed that Putin could use the Turkish offensive as an excuse to expand Russian influence, because beyond you know, having strategic military bases in Syria, they also have very lucrative oil and gas contracts. And actually, they would love the US to stay completely out of this area. It could be that Russia could now be playing a role of a mediator to try and stop the bloodshed between the Turks and the Kurds, and thus strengthening their position in the...
But certainly a much more
in a way to strengthen their position.
Yes, well, I mean, this is the 19th century all over again, in which, you know, and I do think in the long run, Erdogan has probably overplayed his hand, because eventually, because he's been buying Russian military equipment, and NATO doesn't like that because they'll have to integrate the systems and so on. I mean, look, what we'll see over the next 5 years, regardless of whether Trump is reelected, and I don't think he will be, is that Russia has now asserted itself. It has formed a strong partnership with Iran, and so you have this kind of new geopolitics forming, where you're coming out of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. You have Russia now becoming a regional hegemon as America has pulled back. And I'm not sure that anyone, even people who are against wars in Iraq in 2003, will be happy with the results from that.
Michael, Nabila, Catherine and Agnes, thank you all very much once again, and thank you for joining us. That's it from Dateline. Back same time next week. Goodbye.